Hello, friends, welcome again. Friends, today we want to discuss a very important poem, very popular poem written by Dylan Thomas, who is a modern poet of English literature. And the title of this poem is Do Not Go Gentle into That Night. Friends, as I have discussed in one of my previous videos, if you want to appreciate any poem, if you want to understand or analyze a poem of English literature, then it can be done on some 4 to 5 levels. Okay, so the first thing that you need to do while understanding a poem is find out the name of the poet and get some biographical details of the poet, number one. Number two, try to understand the poem line by line, means the whole paraphrasing of the poem, what the poet wants to express through his words, through the lines that he has presented in his poem. You try to understand the poem line by line. Number two. Number three is to understand the major themes of the poem. Theme means the central idea. Okay, so what central idea is presented by the poet, that you need to find out. And number four, you also examine the structure of the poem or the form of the poem, whether the poem is a sonnet, whether it is a lyric poem, whether it is an elegy, a ballad, or what kind of a poem it is. Okay, so you examine the structure of the poem, and then you also examine the meter, what meter, whether it is iambic pentameter or whether it is dactylic tetrameter or anapist, or what kind of meter is used and what kind of rhyming is done by the poet. Okay, so you need to examine these things. And the last important thing to find out as a student of poetry, as a student of English poetry, is to see how the poet has used different poetic devices to express his ideas, right? Poetic devices means the figures of speech. So friends, today, as I told you, we want to discuss the poem written by Dylan Thomas. The title of the poem is Do Not Go Gentle into That Night, and we are going to analyze this poem on these 5 different platforms, okay, as you can see on the screen. So first let's begin with some biographical details of the poet. As you can see on the screen, Dylan Thomas was born in 1914, okay, and he died in 1953. That means he was the 20th century poet. He was living during the first half of the 20th century. And friends, remember, in the history of English literature, this first half of the 20th century is considered as the modern age. Okay, so you can say that Dylan Thomas was a modern poet of England, modern poet of English literature. If I tell you something more about his personal life, then remember that Dylan Thomas, he left his school at the age of 16. He stopped studying over there and he began writing poetry at a very early age. So he was interested in developing his career as a poet right from his childhood. In fact, many of his poems, including these 2 poems, remember these are the 2 important poems written by Thomas, and they are and death shall have no dominion. This poem number 1. And Before I Knocked, this poem number 2. These both poems were written by Dylan Thomas when he was still a teenager. So you can imagine, at a very early age, he became a very popular poet. In fact, Thomas' poetry was so good and it caught the attention of some great English poets of the 20th century like Thomas Stearns Eliot, George Gregson and Stephen Spender. Friends, remember, T.S. Eliot is considered as the most important poet of the modern English literature during the 20th century. And you'll be surprised to know that T.S. Eliot, such an extraordinary poet, was also much impressed by some poems of Thomas Dylan. Okay, and Thomas Dylan published some of his poems in the form of a book of poetry, in which 18 poems were there. At that time, he was only of 20 years, right? But though he was popular as a poet in his times, it was, very difficult for him to make his livelihood from this profession of writing poetry. Okay, so side by side, while writing poetry, he also worked with BBC Radio and he performed in BBC radio dramas as well. And Thomas even dabbled in film and scripted at least 5 movies, including This Is Color, which was released in 1942, and Conquest of a Germ, released in 1944. So he was an artist, he was a myriad-minded man, right? He was a poet, but he worked with BBC, he worked in films also. Now, despite Thomas' personal success, his personal life was very difficult. Why? Because he was suffering from some breathing issues since his childhood, and it troubled him all throughout his life. He died at a very early age of 39, and despite passing away at such a young age, remember, Dylan Thomas is considered as one of the most influential poets of the modern world, of the modern period in English literature, and he is certainly one of the most famous Welsh poets of all times, right? So, Dylan Thomas, friends, is an extraordinary literary personality of the 20th century English literature. Okay, so now let's start the discussion of the poem itself. Let me introduce you to the poem. Remember, this poem, Do Not Go Gentle Into That Night, was published by Dylan Thomas in 1951. Dylan Thomas himself died in 1952, so just 1 year before his death, this poem was published. It is his most famous poem, and in fact, it might be one of the most famous poems of the 20th century also. He composed this poem when he was traveling with his wife and children in Italy in 1947, and then it was published later as a part of his 1952 poetry collection. Okay, and Thomas actually was inspired to write this poem because he saw that his father was afraid of death. His father was dying. So it is believed that to encourage his father to fight against death, this poem was composed by Thomas Dylan. Okay, now friends, let's have a look at this poem. As you can see on the screen, this poem is written in stanzas of 3 lines. Okay, and friends, this one stanza of 3 lines is known as a tercet. Tercet. Okay, so as you can see on the screen, we have first tercet, that means the first stanza, then the second stanza, third stanza, fourth stanza, fifth stanza. So 5 tercets, and last we have a quatrain. A quatrain is a stanza of 4 lines, right? So friends, just have a look at this structure of the poem, right? This poem is written in the stanzas of tercets, right? Let's read this poem. Do not go gentle into that night, old rage should burn and rave at close of day. So the poem begins with an imperative sentence. Okay, it is a kind of a request, or you can say even the order. He tells his father. In fact, this poem is addressed to his father. Here in this poem, the poet, the narrator, tells his father not to be gentle and go into that good night. Friends, underline these words, good night, the last words of the first line, because these words are a metaphor. Metaphor is a poetic device, right? Here, good night, these words stand for death. Okay, so the poet tells his father not to go gently into death. That means the poet wants to say that do not accept death so passively, right? Old age should burn and rave at close of day. Means the poet wants to say that close of day. Now this close of day is again a metaphor. Close of day means death. Okay. So the poet wants to say that one should always rave and burn against death. Means one should not accept death so easily. Okay. The third line, rage means anger. Okay. The poet wants to say that one should be angry against the dying of the light. Dying of the light, against this, mark this, underline these words, dying of the light. So dying of the light again means death. Okay. So all 3 lines, there are 3 metaphors. Good night stands for death, close of day stands for death, and dying of the light also stand for death. Okay, so that was the first tercet. Let's move on to discuss the second tercet. In the second tercet, he talks about, second tercet onwards, he starts talking about 4 kinds of men. He first here in this tercet, second stanza, he talks about the wise men. He says, though wise men at their end know dark is right. Wise people know that dark is right. Dark means death. Again, this word is a metaphor. That death is inevitable. You cannot escape from death. Okay? Because their words have fought no lightning, they do not go gentle into that good night. Here, the poet wants to say that even the wise men, the wise people know that death is compulsory for everybody. It is inevitable for everybody, and no great words, your knowledge all throughout the life that you have gathered also is helpless when your death comes near, right? Next stanza, the poet talks about good men. Okay, in the previous stanza he talks about the wise men. Now he talks about good men. He says, good men, the last wave by. The last wave by means when they say goodbye crying how bright their frail deeds might have danced in a green bay, right? So green bay, these words, underline these words, green bay. Green bay stands for happiness, right? This suggests happiness, these words. Okay, so good men at last wave by, crying how bright their frail deeds. Frail means useless, deeds means actions. Good men also know that how all throughout their life, whatever actions they performed, they proved frail, they proved useless, but rage against the dying of the light. But the poet says that you must show your anger against that. You must have some courage to fight against the dying of the light. Dying of the light again means death. Okay, in the next stanza, the poet talks about wild man. Here, wild man who caught and sang the sun in flight. There are some people whom Dylan Thomas considers wild men. They sang the sun in flight. Means they are so careless all throughout their life. They always sang the glory of their success in the sun in flight, and learned too late they grieved it on its way. But when they come near to death, they also start grieving. Grieving means becoming sad. Okay, but he says, do not go gentle into that good night. That means you do not accept death so gently. In such a gentle manner, one should not accept death. Okay, and the next stanza again he talks about grave man. Okay, so wise man, good man, wild man, and now in this stanza he talks about grave man. Grave man means the serious people. Okay, what do these serious people do? Grave man near death, when they come near death, who see with blinding sight, blind eyes could blaze like meteors and be gay. Their eyes become blind and could blaze like meteors, right? They also should blaze. Blaze means to show brilliance like meteors. Meteors means the falling stars, right? Like meteors, and be gay. Gay means happy. So even the grave people, the most serious people also, they try to be happy even at the end of their life. And again he repeats the same line, rage against the dying of the light. That means one should show courage, right? One should show confidence of living, though he knows that death is near. And the last stanza, the quatrain, is very important. Read this last stanza. And you, my father, there on the sad height, curse, bless me now with your fire's tears. He says to his father that you are now there on the sad height. Sad height means you are now on the verge of death. Okay, curse and bless me, whatever you want to do. If you wish, you can curse me, okay, or if you wish, you can bless me. Now with fire's tears, I pray, do not go gentle into that good night. He prays his father, he requests his father not to be so gentle, not to be so passive in accepting death. Okay, and he says again, rage against the dying of the light. He says, in all, he wants to say that he tells his father that please fight against death. Don't accept death so easily. Okay. So now let's understand the poem in detail by discussing the central ideas as expressed by Dylan Thomas in this poem. So remember, friends, as you now know that death is inevitable. Inevitable means compulsory. Okay, this is the central idea presented by Dylan Thomas in this poem. This poem is seen as a grieving man's anger at death, okay, which has come to take his father away. The phrase good night here refers to death, and it has some references like when we say goodbye to people, right? When you say goodbye, so goodbye is a point. When do we say goodbye? Goodbye is said when we are departing from each other, right? So good night is the word which suggests death. Okay, but specifically, if I talk about this poem, then it tells people not to go gentle into death. Here, the word gentle means docile or passive or without resistance. I mean, the poet wants to say one should always resist the idea of death. No doubt, you cannot escape from death, but you should always think about life, not death. So, this is the idea that he wants to present here. As I told you while we were discussing the lines of this poem, this word rage, it shows courage against what? Against the dying of the light. Dying of the light means death. Okay, for Dylan Thomas, the best way is to face death with strength and power, like the wild heroes of the olden stories. It is very important to note that although Dylan Thomas tells readers to struggle against death, this is not a poem about triumphing over death. Okay, I mean one cannot triumph, one cannot defeat death, right? The poem focuses on a person's literal final choice, not whether or not to die. I mean, you don't have any choice whether to die or not. We don't have any choice, right? Because death is compulsory for everyone. But how they will face this death, that is important. How you live your life is more important than how you die. So, according to Dylan Thomas, life is important, not the thoughts of death. Okay. Another central idea which is found in this poem is the importance of vitality in life. Vitality means liveliness. Okay, so it's not, it is said in our common terms also, it is believed that it's not so much important how long you live, it is more important how well you are living, how lively you are in your life. Okay, in this poem, Dylan Thomas has created tension between death, okay, and life. Death, which he speaks about symbolically through different images of night and darkness, and life he represents through images of light. Say, for example, take a look at the second line of the poem when Thomas says, close of the day. Close of the day means that. Okay, he also says people should burn against it. Burn against it, that means one should produce light against that. Why? Because burning creates light. Okay, the act of putting two unlike things like light and dark, okay, side by side, this is a poetic device called juxtaposition. All throughout the poem, the poet has used the words which are referring to life and death. Okay, and these words are used side by side in the same lines. Okay, so this is called the use of juxtaposition, which is a kind of figure of speech. In this poem, the juxtaposition emphasizes the contrast between life and death. If death is dark and inevitable, then the juxtaposition helps readers see that life is powerful and full of energy. Okay, if you read these lines, good men, the last wave by, crying how bright, their frail deeds might have danced in a green bay. If you read these lines here, there are two examples of light imagery in these lines. Number one, the word bright, and number two, the words green bay. Okay, these words help to describe the good man's life, which is full of light and energy. After all, even though his deeds are frail means minor or not so much important or useless actions. Okay, they still might have danced. Okay, so dancing suggests happiness, right? It suggests positivity. So in this passage we can see how the living are full of vital or powerful energy. Through this, the poet tells the readers that the true tragedy of aging and that is that it takes away the vitality of life. So, friends, what I want to say is that this poem gives us a very important message that life must be vital, life must be full of life. Sometimes we people live life, but there is no liveliness in our personality. So, the message of the poem is that one should always enjoy and celebrate each and every moment of life till death comes to you. And even if death comes to you, you have to fight against the death, with courage and with positivity. Okay, now let's have a look at some poetic devices or figures of speech used by Dylan Thomas in this poem. Now what are these figures of speech? What are these poetic devices? As you know, that you cannot build a house without some tools like hammers, wrenches, and saws, right? You need some tools to build a house. In the same manner, the poet needs some tools to write his poem. Okay, and these tools are known as poetic devices. Okay, as I discussed earlier, the poet has used some poetic devices like metaphors, juxtaposition, repetition of words and lines. These are the three important poetic devices found in this poem. If I talk about the form of the poem, then let me tell you that this is a special kind of a poem which is known as Villanelle. A Villanelle is a type of a special poetic structure found in English poetry. This kind of lyric actually, originated in English poetry during the period of Renaissance. That means during the 16th and 17th century. Okay, but this became very popular only after 19th century, right? Villanelle is what? Let's try to understand this structure. A Villanelle has 19 lines. This is a poem written in 19 lines. Just like sonnet is written in 14 lines and Villanelle is written in 19 lines. It has 5 tercets. Tercet means a stanza of 3 lines and 1 quatrain at the end. Quatrain means a stanza of 4 lines. Okay, so these are the requirements. It is written in 19 lines, okay, 5 tercets and 1 quatrain. At the same time, another important characteristic of this kind of a lyric villanelle is that it has 2 refrains and 2 repeating rhymes. Refrain means, it is a set of lines which are repeated at regular intervals all throughout the poem. As you can see in this poem, these lines do not go gentle into that good night. This line is repeated many times in the poem, right? And in the same manner, another refrain, rage, rage against the dying of the light. This line is also repeated, right? So this repetition of the same line is known as a refrain. So in every villanelle, 2 refrains are used. That means any 2 lines are repeated, which you can see in this poem. At the same time, the rhymes are also repeated. 2 kinds of rhymes are presented in such poems. Okay, as you can see here, the words night, light, right, bright, flight, sight, and height. Okay, this is one set of rhymes, and another set of rhymes which we find is day, day, bay, way, gay, and pray. So here we have 2 sets of rhymes and 2 refrains. So all in all, you can say that this is a nice villanelle kind of lyric. So friends, here we come to the end of this discussion of this poem. But before I depart, let me conclude the whole idea that Dylan Thomas is a modern English poet of the 20th century, and in this poem he has released a very important message for all of us, that we should enjoy and celebrate life, celebrate each and every moment of life, with full vitality and with energy. And whenever death comes near, we should fight against the death with great courage and valor. So friends, here I put an end to this video. Friends, if you really like this video, please share this video among your friends. Thank you very much.